Okay, so our next panel, we have two presentations. The first one will be by Siobhan Linen, who is the Virtual Reference and Accessibility for Ontario College's Library Service, and Corinne Abba, who's the AODA Coordinator, Diversity, Equity, and Human Rights Services. And then followed by that, we'll have their presentation will be on Library eResource Accessibility Project, LEAP. And then after that, we will have Andrea Kosavic, the Associate Dean, Digital Engagement and Strategies at York University Libraries, and Meredith Hatton, Manager, Access Services and Library Accessibility Services here at York University Library, and they will be presenting on assessing the accessible content provider landscape in North America. And we'll have time for questions at the end of both presentations.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is this all good? So thank you for having me. Unfortunately, my esteemed colleague, Siobhan, could not be with us today, but she's fine and safely at home taking care of her child, so we wish her the best. So my name's Corinne, and I would like to share with you our work on LEAP, which is the Library eResource Accessibility Project, an initiative that seeks accessible solutions for library e-resources. First things first, as always, I want to make sure that this event is accessible to you. We're all pretty familiar with how to engage and make things accessible, but I do just want to check in and make sure the space is comfortable for you. Everyone can hear me okay and interact with the presentation in the way of your choosing. As mentioned, our presentation today is going to involve two panel presentations followed by a group discussion. Throughout, we endeavor to be inclusive of the full range of diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human difference. I would like to thank our conference organizers and our live captioners for contributing to the accessibility of this session, as well as our live stream folks. That's super helpful. This particular presentation is available in alternate formats upon request, and I do encourage you, if you experience any barriers to access throughout this presentation, to please let me know or one of the conference organizers so that we can address that. So basically, I want to start by providing some context for LEAP, where we're coming from, some rationale for that work. I'd also like to establish our vision and describe what we're building, the tool that we are building in order to meet and exceed our legislative requirements, specifically as it relates to library databases. And then I'd also like to discuss where we're going, our next steps in the project, how we can collaborate with you and our wider community going forward. So kind of building a community of practice as well. The first step, though, is to identify gaps or barriers in our library service. So I'd like to introduce you to Jay. Jay is a third-year business student who uses screen reader software. Jay needs to do a basic keyword search in order to find articles, and they'll be doing that using the library's main interface. So I wanted to put the question out to you. Have you ever experienced a database results page using a screen reader or screen reader software? Can we see a show of hands? Has anyone experimented with this or needed to use it? Okay, so not many. That's my summary, not many. I'm not good with math. So we're gonna try to replicate this experience for you using an audio clip from JAWS. We've also provided a transcript for those who can't access the audio. And this might start to give you a sense of the experience and keeping in mind the variability of all users' experience. So if you give me a moment, and hope I don't need assistance. Are things happening?
George Brown College Library Learning Commons Navigation Region Heading Level 2 Folder Access and Help Sign in Menu Folder Menu Preferences Menu Language Menu Sub-Menu Research Help Menu Help using EBSCO Menu Heading Level 2 Browse Resources Toolbar Library Home Menu New Search Menu Multimedia Search Menu Journals Magazines and Newspapers Menu Navigation Region End Banner Link Accessibility Information and Tips Revised Date 07/2015 Heading Level 1 Result List Accessibility Training Search Region Visited Link Graphic Library Logo Search Heading Level 2 EBSCO List Search List of 3 items Please enter search term left paren S right paren Alt+2 Edit as pop-up Accessibility Training Select a field left paren Optional right paren Button and button Please enter search term left paren S right paren Edit as pop-up Select a field left paren Optional right paren Button and button Please enter search term left paren S right paren Edit as pop-up Select a field left paren Optional right paren Button List End Link Add row Link Remove row Search button Clear button Link Graphic Search Help Left paren Opens a new window Right paren List of 3 items Link Basic Search Link Advanced Search Link Search History List End Search Region End Link Graphic Library Logo Banner End Main Region List of 3 items Relevance button Page Options button Alert Save and Share Results Region Share button Alert Save and Share Results Region End List End Heading Level 2 Search Results 1-20 of 8,934 Heading Level 2 Result List of 20 items 1. Link Analyze the Accessibility Aplicação Partial do Modelo Psicogia Centro de Ensino de uma Instituição Federal de Ensino Alt+1 Online Research Help Dialog This is an invitation from ASCON staff to chat for help. Press escape or select no thanks to dismiss dialog. Clickable click to chat button no thanks button.
Okay. Thank you. So what you've just heard is the results that a screen reader would read when entering in some basic keywords like accessibility training, just as the example. So this is all the information, all the pieces of information, the coding, the headings, etc., that is processed through a screen reader. So for this example, and thank you for sitting through it, I do think it's important to try to replicate that experience. I know it does take a long time, but the point is it takes a long time. So that took about 2 minutes to reach the first article on the list of results. And that article is not even in English, so our patron probably wouldn't be pleased with that as a starting point. So the question to you, does this process surprise you? Does it mortify you? Does it horrify you? It does me. So this is the process. To be fair, an adept screen reader user would very likely be speeding up the process, speeding up the speaking voice, using the tab function to skip over many of the headings, and they would, because they're adept, reach the results much faster than us using a screen reader, but not as us using our vision to interact with this page, right? So I just want to underline the burden of our inaccessible resources should never fall to our patrons, right? That should never be the expectation. So what's the solution to this particular barrier? We propose LEAP. So the primary purpose of LEAP is to assist Ontario College libraries in ensuring the accessibility of electronic resources by meeting and exceeding the legislative deadlines under the AODA in support of accessible electronic resources. So LEAP will better help us understand the accessibility features and the limitations of specific databases, and will give our library staff the tools required to help mitigate or minimize that impact on our students. In the meantime, I don't want to forget about Jay. So these are real people. So in the meantime, Jay would seek support with our library staff who could help them navigate the database. Which is not ideal, but that would be the kind of the workaround at this point. So just to give you some background and establish our vision, in 2015, college libraries and the Ontario Colleges Library Service, or OCLS, undertook an environmental scan to understand accessibility requirements, identify guidelines and best practices, and gain an understanding of what other libraries were doing to help address this gap. We didn't find any existing solutions that would meet the specific needs that we outlined, and so we decided to build a custom tool for colleges to assess eResources and also engage in a process of collaboration, which will allow us to share our results and assessments. So the LEAP tool would have two main components. First, it would guide library staff step by step through the process of assessing an electronic resource based on an established set of accessibility criteria. The tool will also embed instructional content so that the library staff, regardless of their experience or expertise, can easily complete such assessments. The second component is to have a repository of assessment reports. So as library staff move through the assessment, their results will be captured. There's going to be a score that's tallied by the tool, and the report with results and the score would be housed in a repository that can be accessed by participating libraries. Since we're building the tool, not just the tool, but the assessment process, an important early step for our LEAP steering committee was to compile a list of criteria from the range of web accessibility standards. So we worked from a list of over 100 criteria and narrowed that down to 33, which we then grouped into specific categories addressing four main components: appearance, navigation, structure, and content, so that it could apply to any given database. Ultimately, we needed to come up with one list of core criteria that could be used as the basis for our assessment process. So the thing about accessibility criteria is that it can be pretty technically complex for non-experts to evaluate. So it was important for us to develop an easy-to-follow assessment process that was supported by detailed instructions that guide the evaluator through the end-to-end process. So as part of this development, we ran 2 user testing phases with our steering committee as well as with library staff from our AODA committee. During these phases, our groups used kind of 4 draft modules to go through the assessments of actual eResource products and then provide valuable feedback to us on both the testing process and the instructional content. So how we had put it together, whether going through it was effective, etc. So the 4 modules are aligned with our list of core criteria, which I mentioned. So interface appearance, navigation, structure, and content. Currently, these modules exist in draft formats, and we use Google Forms to do that. And we wanted to provide you with these as examples so that you can start to kind of think about or visualize how the assessment components would work. So just some brief snapshots here. Each module is set up as a multi-page form. There will be a brief introduction at the beginning of each module, along with a list of all the tools that would be required to complete each module, including the software required or browser extensions as needed. The modules are then broken down into a series of tests, which are based on the list of accessibility criteria developed by the LEAP steering committee. And then each test basically starts out with some background information that will help the person evaluating understand why this particular criteria is important and what they need to look for in order to properly assess an e-resource. So in this example, we're looking at labels. Is it properly labeled so that, for example, when a screen reader runs through it, they're actually hearing what is there, and all the coding is correctly identifying things for them. And then following that, there are instructions. So in this example, the test instructs the evaluator to download a specific extension, to locate specific fields within the page, and then conduct a visual assessment. So this is another snapshot. Our goal is to make sure that each test is easy to follow so that library staff know exactly what to look for, how to look for it, and that when they do their inputs, filling out these forms, that it's consistent, and then it will result also in consistent scoring. So each module contains several tests. On average, during our testing period, each module took about 30 minutes to an hour for people to complete. As staff become more familiar with the process and with the tools they're using, this time would likely decrease, so it would become easier and more time efficient to use. A key requirement of the tool, thinking about the people who will be using it and making sure that that experience is a good one for them, is the ability to save work as well as to move back and forth, to skip tests, to return to them as needed, so that we can make this a part of people's daily workflow and not have it overburden them, right? So they can go back to it as they can and as needed. So where we're at now, we are ready to begin the tool. So we did a lot of background work, a lot of research, a lot of testing, and we're ready to build. So we issued an RFP and have awarded the contract to an Ontario developer. We anticipate building the tool in the winter and spring of 2019 with user testing in the summer, and then potentially a second phase of development to follow. The decision was made to build a tool using Drupal, which allows us to meet most, if not all, of our requirements, tool requirements, including web accessibility standards. The tool will consist of the assessment modules, a repository of completed assessments, as well as user and admin dashboards, and potentially other features like a forum space. In addition to building the tool itself, there are other key deliverables, and we're in the process of assembling working groups to begin in the spring to complete work related to several key areas, including tool implementation. So what will it look like at the local level to incorporate this tool into our procurement or acquisitions process? We also have a group around shared workflow, so recommendations outlining the responsibilities of various stakeholders, how to allow for collaboration and sharing, and to ensure that the assessments are reviewed and refreshed periodically. We also want to focus on competency building, change management, and training for staff who will be using the tool, so making sure all those supports are in place. And then finally would be the tool launch, communications with the college and our stakeholders, and then have workflow beginning at the local level. Of course, we're also looking to expand beyond. We're kind of working on this now at the college level, but we are consistently looking for people of interest in how to expand that work as we go forward. So in terms of the LEAP tool, we envision library staff evaluating their existing database collections and integrating this process into their acquisitions workflow so that accessibility can really be considered in a very meaningful way through database trials, et cetera. We want to be able to share our findings with vendors and use those findings to advocate for changes that promote accessibility, better vendor agreements, changes to the databases, et cetera. We want to translate our evaluation results into user support. So this would include providing summaries of accessibility features and also providing any workarounds for known accessibility barriers. How can we help people overcome that? How can we put the supports in place that they won't experience the barrier to that degree? And then, of course, we want to build our competencies amongst library staff to establish a stronger foundation for addressing accessibility issues. So as we look forward and as we try to envision the project's success, we look to you and also to the wider community for opportunities for collaboration. To support the success of our library patrons, we want to continue to build a community of practice, kind of under the guise of finding solutions for everything is kind of our approach. So for us, this means nurturing accessibility champions, appealing to our experts, developing collaborative standards, sharing our best practices, and integrating accessibility into our everyday workflow. So I look forward to the panel discussion that follows. I wanted to offer these questions to get us thinking about next steps of the project, especially in terms of collaboration and how you might be able to participate. And that's all I have for you. So I'll flip it over to our next presentation, and then we'll do the big discussion at the end. Thank you.
All right. So today, Meredith and I will talk to you about our journey into assessing the accessible content provider landscape. And I guess I'd want to share with you first how this survey actually came to be. Meredith came to me as Director of Accessibility Services at York University Libraries and said, I think it's time to renew our digitization infrastructure. And the question I had for her was, what is happening in the broader landscape? Are digitization requests increasing? Is this projected to be an ongoing need? Could we have an idea of what the landscape might look like? And so this led to the collaborative development of this survey, which was circulated in Canada and the US between September and October 2018. And we had 24 responses, with 75% of them being from Canada and 6% from the US. So in looking at this slide, we asked who provides accessible formats at your institution. And what I want to draw to your attention is that respondents could pick more than one service provider, first of all. And looking at this slide, we see that libraries have much responsibility in this space, but tend to share this responsibility with a number of other entities, both for Canada and for the overall sample. So in the US, libraries are less involved in this role, as only 50% of the 6 respondents listed libraries in this area. And this is consistent, actually, with a recent Libraries Take Aim report on accessible instructional materials and higher education. This report was released in 2017. And it took an in-depth look at the provision of accessible materials in U.S. higher education. And I have a little quote from this report that I'd like to share. They found that rarely is the library a leading provider of accessible content for students with disabilities. This is particularly true for content and materials required for classes. Most often, disability resources and services will bear the responsibility of providing and/or creating accessible course content. So this was, again, a study in the US. We didn't find that to be true in our sample, but it's just interesting to bear in mind as we're moving through the rest of the data that we'll be providing for you. So we also wanted to have an understanding of the popularity of accessible formats. And so we looked at PDF, we looked at EPUB, and we looked at Braille. And again, the same report, the Libraries Take Aim report, suggests that, and I quote, "Many hope that EPUB will be the de facto standard for digital publishing, so that standards for accessibility can be built into easy production of content." And so looking at this data, we see that there's a long way to go, that the EPUB, as depicted by the red line, is depicted as least popular, and we still see the predominance of PDF. And I see some heads nodding, so this is what we're experiencing still, so there's still a way to go. We wanted to know a little bit about computing platform preferences, and unsurprisingly, PCs still dominate the landscape, but it was surprising, at least for me, to see that Mac is sort of gaining, and only 23% of the responding institutions actually provided both PC and Mac platforms for their users, and there were only 2 in the sample, but you can imagine that this might be significant at the user end, where they only support PCs, but they indicated in the survey that their users actually prefer Macs. So, some challenges from an infrastructure perspective. So I'm going to invite Meredith to talk to you about accessible books.
So the next part of the survey, we had a focus on accessible books. And from this, the survey results from the respondents, 8 institutions in Canada had less than 800 book requests per year. Vast majority of the data set, both in Canada and the US, and more broadly, had requests over 100, and in more cases, more requests of 200 plus. The singles are quite loud and clear from this data set here that the requests are quite numerous and high in demand. The average turnaround for was another question we had. The average turnaround for time for a 350-page book. Looking at this high demand area, we wanted to have a look at what are the service level demands. For most of the sample was able to turn around a book in 1 week or less. 28% of Canada's service providers were able to turn around a book in 1 day, which is pretty remarkable. None of our U.S. respondents were able to match our Canadian leaders on that turnaround time, which was kind of interesting from our survey respondents. Percentage of book requests requiring original scans. 14 respondents, we had 14 respondents in this area. 36% of the requests are in the 20 to 40% range. 64% of the requests are in the 5 to 15% range. Next question that we had in regards to content, do you make use of a central repository? And then we had asked is select all that apply. So people could select from all the multiple options of what they're doing in regards to a central repository. So from this result, you see that there's a lot of repository use in-house and consortial. This should be thought of an area as opportunity. The opportunity perhaps is greatest in the US, where 67% of the respondents reported that they're not making use of a repository. However, in contrast, in Canada, 6% of the Canadian respondents were not making use of a repository. So from this, we found that the Canadians are making great use of repositories for obtaining, for retention. Next question, how many faculty, staff, and students does your institution provide all formats per year? And this turned into a very interesting divide. Canada and US are aligned for the most part on this. You'll see from the graph that 80 users is about the dividing line. So you have a dividing line at the 80 users. So either they go up to 80 users or less, or then once they get past the 80 user, they're serving well plus 80 users. With 35% of the institution serving approximately 100 to 200 users per year. Arrangements with publisher file repositories. Respondents were allowed to choose all that apply for this question. As you can see, we see Bookshare Canada, Bookshare US, and SIA. From that, just to bring some background, if you're not familiar with those resources, Bookshare US is the one that we are able to obtain our accessible content. However, we go through Celia to obtain it here in Canada. So we figured that there was probably some confusion with that, and from looking at that, you can roll up the Celia. So you can roll up Celia to Bookshare US to Bookshare Canada to see that there is quite a demand for utilizing that publisher file repository. Another area that came out that stands out is Access Text Network, and with a very high usage. I also don't want to forget Arrow. Arrow, once again, is one of the more predominant ones as well. For publishers outside of the larger sharing networks, have you had any luck securing special arrangements to obtain accessible versions of e-text, e-books for registered students? And we had a nice response. There was excellent response rates from the respondents. There's a lot of hope in this slide, and that by large, institutions have been successful in obtaining accessible versions of e-text for their students, as we see from the results. And we're also we're able to obtain a listing of from respondents who had had great success with obtaining an accessible version of e-text, e-books from this rather large list of the following. I'm now going to turn it back over to Andrea for digitization services.
Thanks, Meredith. I hope that previous slide, and I was so excited. There were a couple of respondents who really just gave us these massive lists of publishers, and I'm hoping that if you've had challenges with one of these publishers in the past, that you can use this data in your arguments to try to secure. And I just did want to mention as well that we've published this data set. It's completely open, and it's there for you to use to make whatever it is that you might need it for. So, back to our original question that inspired this the survey was digitization services and the demand for digitization services. So, this is the slide that I needed, really, to renew the digitization infrastructure. So again, overwhelming yes for offering digitization services. And we see, and this really surprised me, but I guess it shouldn't have, that digitization requests over the last 3 years have increased, close to 60%, and 20% have remained constant. So there's still great demand in this area. And we can see from this chart, number of digitization requests fulfilled per year, that for the overall sample, 50% of the overall respondents see over 100 digitization requests per year, with a quarter of these being in the 500 plus category, which is significant. So in Canada, 40% of our users report over 100 requests per year, with over 20% of Canadian respondents being in that 500 plus requests per year category. So are students required to purchase materials for which they are requesting alternate formats? That was our question. And so we do see in this sample that library collections are actively being used to fulfill alternate format requests. The qualifiers in the data show, and you'll see this if you go through the data set, is that textbooks. So a lot of libraries had policies where they wouldn't buy textbooks, and so students were required then to buy the textbooks so that they could be digitized. So bearing in mind the distributed service providers across institutions, right? So we saw that breadth of service providers in this space. Where libraries are not always represented, this data may hint at what is lost when libraries are not involved in the accessible content service provider landscape, in that students need to make up that shortfall and purchase all materials, right? That's a question that we don't have the answer to with the data from this data set, but it may be an interesting question to ask in future studies, whether that really is the case. So funding sources for purchase of digitization equipment, really no surprises here with respect to the distribution that we've seen in service provision across campuses. And then for hardware used for digitization, so honestly, what I was really hoping for was getting a tip. Somebody would be able to share, we've got this amazing setup and we want everyone to know about it, and you must buy this particular scanner. And what we saw instead was, the overhead scanners have not really seen a lot of uptake, at least from our respondents. And we see a lot of document feeder and flatbed setups persisting. For image capture preferences, there's a lot of, it's all over the map. What was interesting and what I highlighted in the data here is that some of the institutions exclusively offered only certain levels of resolution. So, 2 in the sample, only black and white, 6 in the sample, only color, and 16 only grayscale. So grayscale seems to dominate in that regard, but then looking at color, it's also quite present there in the space. So for post-processing operations in use, again, I can imagine this data set being useful for folks to refer to if you're If you're looking for perhaps other means by which you would augment the quality, we see OCR is pretty much a standard across the board. Deskuing, we realize, is tied to a good OCR result, so you want to deskew before you OCR, alt text really being there in the space. Didn't see a lot of image cleanup or digital erasing, which I actually found quite surprising. And this may be because a certain percentage of the sample is not using library materials, but I think all of us may have had at some point a book that was completely underlined and that you needed to edit, and if you wanted to be able to provide that content to a student in a timely manner, you needed to commit to that digital erasing. And so then, speaking to software used for OCR creation, I'm assuming that there's probably not a lot of surprises here with this data as well, where we have Omni Professional. Adobe Acrobat Professional is ubiquitous, I'm guessing, just because it's around and it's probably already installed on institutional computers by way of some broader campus agreement. And then Abby was also quite prominent in this space. And we also just wanted to ask about software for delivering mathematical materials. So again, please have a look at the data set. If certain solutions aren't working for you, you might want to try CAR or math type. So there's quite a breadth of, it kind of gives you an idea of this area being a very challenging space and people trying a lot of different things. So then, asking about the percentage of respondents who offer professionally produced Microsoft Word materials, and we were talking about sort of OCR verification and correction, and we saw that only 40% of our respondents were in this space. And what was interesting when we looked at the replies in the States, all of this was done in-house. And in Canada, those who did offer this service were looking to make use of service providers as well. And so I'll bring Meredith back to talk about Braille and tactile Braille.
So we wanted to have some more information in regards to Braille and tactile Braille. And for different reasons, we had challenges with fulfillment, making sure that we got in time for our students. And we wanted to see what was going on in the broader landscape. And from that, we found that Braille is at 70% across the board, and tactile Braille is 55% across the board with all respondents, which tells us that the demand is high across all the sampling. Timelines for providing Braille and tactile Braille. As we all know, the work, time, effort, and cost of creating or requiring Braille materials can be highly variable depending on the types of material that we need to be provided. We see that in this graph that these timelines are much less variable and in contrast to turnaround times for PDF or EPUB, which is obviously a great detriment to those users. Braille and tactile Braille requests are fulfilled by. So this tells us some really interesting information. We kind of know what was going on here in Ontario, but it was kind of interesting to see what was going outside. For the 5 U.S. respondents who replied to this question, all had in-house solutions for Braille production. So they had an actual department within their institution that they were able to go to get their Braille fulfilled. And in Ontario, we have access to Arrow, and as we can see from the survey results, that we lean heavily on their service. And then noting the rest of Canada, the demand being a combination of outsourcing and in-house production. And I'm just going to bring Andrea back to explain the data set and where it's available.
Okay. Probably not going to work, but so we have deposited in our repository all of the data in CSV format, and this process, the survey, having gone through the informed consent process and everyone already knowing that this data would be open, we're very happy to share this with you. Oh, here we go. Let's see if it pops up. Anyhow, so please do, I tried to create a bit.ly link for you that might be a little bit easier to access. So please do click on that. The question set is available there. We will be following up with these slides. We just need a little bit of time to add some of the alt text and just ensure that they're accessible as well. So finally, I just wanted to thank everyone who helped us with survey development. A very special thank you to the York University Libraries accessibility team, so Vivian Alfieri, Claudio Lasso, Laszlo Juhos, and Veronica Pinnock. We spent a number of sessions together around the table, just really trying to get at some of the data, and to Nancy Waite from McMaster University Libraries for her help with that. And thank you very much.
So I have a question for the LEAP project. Will you be using maybe like students as test cases just to see how they navigate the databases and where they get stuck using their various screen readers?
That was kind of part of the initial assessment. The idea, I guess, is sort of is the answer. We do want to make sure we're looking at the variability of user experience. And of course, people use screen readers in different ways. People use other things other than screen readers. People use different kinds of screen readers. The goal of LEAP is try to establish a core assessment that will try to address all of those things. So included in our work going forward, I think we will periodically kind of check back in and see if we're able to make recommendations and have improvements being made, have people then have kind of user testing again for that particular database to see if those improvements are felt by the people using screen readers. So that's kind of how we're looking to kind of re-engage with our user base, our patrons as we go forward. That's sort of the idea, but open to suggestion.
Is there
Thank you.
any other questions?
This is also for Corinne. You mentioned that you started off with like 100 criteria and then got it down to 30. Just wondering where the 100 came from.
I will refer to my notes if you don't mind. It came from various lists, so the Matomir list for sure. Where is that? Yes. So we looked at the WCAG 2.0, obviously, Section 508, the amendment to the Rehabilitation Act from the states. Barrier-free walkthrough was another thing that we looked at. The Tatumir accessibility checklist, the ASCLA, so the Association for Specialized and Cooperative Library Agencies, and also the Matterhorn protocol. Those are listed in my notes and the slides that are available. Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. Hi there. It's interesting that you've separated the data up between Canada and United States. I'm curious to know if there are any lessons to be drawn from that.
I think there is, because we did find similarities. We found some similarities and then some differences. And I think both those things are really valuable for us for what we'd like to do to improve our service levels and go to the next step. Also, in saying that it also gives an opportunity for partnerships at some point in time with reaching out to different institutions in the U.S.
So I will admit that I was looking at the questions from the live stream and completely blanked when you asked your question. Could you repeat it for me?
Yeah. It's interesting how you, on the survey, divided the data up between Canada and the United States.
Yeah.
I'm just curious to know if there are any lessons to be learned from either side. Like, what are we doing right and what could we improve upon?
what I think is fascinating, and I should put a link up to the report that I was reading, and I'm just gonna grab that. And it was really speaking to, and so this is the library's Take Aim report on accessible instructional materials. So they were talking about the U.S. accessibility landscape and the broader context. And that whole study, which was highly qualitative, so this kind of supplements with a bit of quantitative data and looks for, to what extent are their findings more broadly represented. What was fascinating was they were doing all of this research because they were looking to make the case for a repository, which is something that we do in OCL, right? That we've been able to unite and to do that. So it became very clear in reading that report that in certain ways, even just the way that libraries were less present in the space than they are in the Canadian context, I thought it would be useful to actually contrast the data sets, just because we have some fundamental differences in who is actually providing the services. So I think we should be congratulated more broadly for the consortial efforts, the conversations that we're having today to actually put our minds together and try to solve these challenges. And I think that's definitely happening in the U.S. as well. But we've definitely have some initiatives too that we should be grateful for.
And something to notice from the U.S. as well, they do have two fantastic databases that we do use here in Ontario, Access Text and Bookshare, which have been really, for myself here at York University, I found that our team has gotten great use from those resources, from the user experience side of it to what's also available in the actual database. Database. I want to call it a database. It's not.
Any other questions? Now that you have the research done, what do you see kind of moving forward in terms of the level and volume of requests? You had shown in the chart that it was increasing. However, in my experiences, I've been at two different institutions here in Ontario. One where the number of requests have decreased due to the accessibility of accessible PDFs and professors sharing more articles compared to textbook-based, compared to now being in an institution where it is very heavy textbook-based and there's multiple texts per class. So just wondering on the information that you've collected, what you kind of see the trend for alternate formats moving forward within the next year to 5 years.
So I definitely think that, and I think much more research could be done, and this was really just a taste. What I found really heartening was the success we've had with publishers to obtain those alternate formats. And I guess my question would be, do they serve the requests sort of all forms of requests, or are they limiting only serving certain types of needs and not all across the board? I definitely, knowing that infrastructure has maybe a 5-year timeline anyhow, personally I'd be looking to at least improve workflows. I think it is very institution specific, right? And it is sobering to see that from an open access perspective, and as more of us move into the open educational resources space, that there is much advocacy work to be had in that area to ensure that the formats that are made are accessible. So perhaps our work might look a little different, and we may not be digitizing as much, but we might be serving the community in with respect to exceptional markup for accessibility purposes. Do you see anything? Yeah, similar. Yeah.
I was just thinking that in addition to, that is heartening to see that there are a lot of independent publishers out there who will share files in electronic format upon request. It would be neat to go a little deeper and find out what their usage agreements are. I'm just thinking, we have, the bulk of our students, are since we're using Arrow to source their textbooks, I mean, there is an expectation to pay through the bookstore to get that book. But if we could figure out where, which publishers don't have that expectation when they share alt format, that would be, I know lots of students would be interested in knowing that, and if we could gather that, then we'd have a better idea of saying, well, no, this one is actually gratis.
Your question makes me ask, and just following up on our keynote's remarks earlier, do our students need to trade their confidentiality in some cases to actually be able to have access to these formats? So I love that idea. I love that idea of mining those agreements and seeing the trends and what the landscape looks like in that area.
Yeah, I just want to add that the Arrow process is confidential.
Oh, good. Okay.
I mean, students are only known to them as a code, and so no names get attached to the books except in our offices.
So we have an online question. And it is, will the LEAP be made available to more than just Ontario colleges? I'm at a small institution in BC, and this would be an amazing resource nationally.
So that's a great question. Everything is open to discussion at this point. The idea that we foresee is, because we're developing this specifically for the Ontario College Libraries and supported by that, that's kind of the focus right now. But what we think is, and it will, because it's kind of a crowd sharing experience, so institutions will be participants, different institutions within the college sector will be responsible for evaluations, and then we'll all share those results. How we foresee it at this point is that other institutions, there'll be different levels of participation and access. So other institutions, like a small institution that doesn't have the capacity, could in some way, and I don't know if it would be fee-based or anything like that at this point, I have no idea, but they could access just the results if they wanted to. Other institutions could participate by doing the evaluations and contributing in that way, and then have access as well. So we're thinking about different levels of access to try to accommodate the most amount of people and to try to engender participation wherever possible. But recognizing that some people don't have the capacity, and we do want to make these results available. We do want to share widely and collaborate wherever possible.
Sorry, we're just looking at the So an institution in Quebec and the University of New Brunswick are also asking the same question, so I guess you address that.
Awesome. I would, if they would like to contact myself or Siobhan, maybe if you want to add our emails to the chat, but it's also on the slides as well, which will be made available. Yes? Do you want me to?
There's no more questions. It's break time. And yes, thank you so much for the panel.